Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I am joined by Right Ruminations and Mr. GeoCon to discuss a three-part essay series that Ed Feser wrote to justify the U.S. invasion of Iraq. This was published around 2006. So why don't you frame this for us, Mr. GeoCon?
Thank you, Todd. Well, if in case anybody doesn't know, Edward Feser is a very popular Thomistic philosopher. Political. He specializes in religion, philosophy of religion, metaphysics, and political philosophy. Now back in 2006, there was an anthology of essays critical of the Iraq War that was published in published. I think it was published. It was written by a lot of the authors from the American Conservative, and it was entitled "GeoCon." Kind of a play on words there. And Feser was not happy with this attack, to say the least, because a lot of his friends were attacked by these people. David S. Otterberg and Michael Novak, for example. They were both attacked as neoconservatives for arguing that the war in Iraq was justified. And so he wrote this three-part essay called Paleoconservatism and the War in Iraq on a now defunct website called Right Reason, in order to prove once and for all that the war in Iraq was, by the standards of Catholic just war theory, a just war, that the war between the U.S. and Iraq that started in 2003 was, as of 2006, justified by the medieval scholastic thinking. And he cites many of these scholastic manuals, like Right and Reason, in order to defend his position. That's all that and now my problem with this entire line of reasoning is, I think Feser sort of tries to he does something that, Todd, you have talked about in the past. Proponents of just war theory sometimes will try to fit a particular war that they want to justify into the theory, when and they try to they leave out important information, or they forget to ask whether it was prudent or not. And the end result is, well, you're just basically justifying. You're coming up with a justification ad hoc. Is that is that how you see it, Todd?
Yeah, I think most just war is post hoc justification for what you already wanted to do anyhow.
Now, while I may disagree with you on on that, I do think that you are correct that a lot of Catholics who believe in just war theory are sort of, depending on their political leanings, they are, how should I put it? They're driven to support whatever war their political leanings lead them to support, and use just war theory afterwards, after the fact, and apply it inconsistently.
Yeah, one of the things is the essays are divided into basically three sections. So the first section is where Feser sort of frames the debate, and he discusses the criteria for just war. So he says that, look, Catholic teaching on just war has a certain trajectory. That this war may or may not be prudent, but it's certainly within my rights to do it. Very, very legalistic. It's like, what's about our rights? And that's what I'm trying to prove. But there's a subtle dishonesty here with Feser, because on the one hand, he says he's merely trying to prove that the Iraq War was inconsistent with Catholic social teaching, but or not social teaching, just war teaching. But then he sort of switches gears in the third and final article, attacking his opponents and saying that this war needed to happen because X, Y, and Z reasons. And the second part is he fleshes out more just war positions. And the third part is he outlines those who oppose the Iraq War. So the problem is he's not really minimally defending the justice of the war in Iraq in some sort of absolute sense. Like, it may not be wise, but it was the right thing. But it was not inconsistent with Catholic just war teaching. The problem is it's a lot more than that, because he basically says in the first essay, oh yeah, you know, if we occupy Iraq, we could pull out of Saudi Arabia, which we did the one, but not the other. So I'm like, no, you're making a more serious claim that not only was it not in conflict with Catholic just war teaching, but it was good. We should have done it. Which, okay, you could make that case too if you wanted, but that's not what he opens up saying he's doing. So for me, I think that's maybe the first thing that I would say is dodgy. It's like he's sort of secretly under the table putting out another implied premise. Now, as a philosopher, Feser should be cognizant of this, because philosophy 101 is, as much as possible, try to avoid implied premises. Now, we're human. We still do that. But I feel like here the implied premise was pretty obvious. It was represented sloppiness rather than something extremely subtle, or even the best of us might have missed it. And I think my main criticism of the actual reasoning is the doctrine of proportionality, which Feser doesn't really mention. So I'll briefly describe the principle of proportionality from the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on just war. The traditional just war theory construes jus ad bellum and jus in bello as sets of principles satisfying which is necessary and sufficient for a war as being permissible. Jus ad bellum typically comprises the following 6 principles. 1, just cause. The war is an attempt to avert the right kind of injury. 2, legitimate authority. The war is fought by an entity that has the authority to fight such wars. 3, right intention. That entity intended to achieve the just cause rather than using it as an excuse to achieve some wrongful end. 4, reasonable prospects of success. The war is sufficiently likely to achieve its aims. 5, proportionality. The morally weighted goods achieved by the war outweigh the morally weighted bads that it will cause. 6, last resort, necessity. There is no other less harmful way to achieve the just cause. Now, Feser does give time to consider to point 6, last resort, i.e. necessity. But let me put it this way, certainly as of 2019, even as of 2006, which, to put this into context, Iraq was a dumpster fire. There was no law and order. We had the runs on the museums, all the crime, all these militias. The surge had not yet happened. Iraq had not yet been stabilized. All of the critics of the neocon operations in Iraq had more or less been vindicated. We went in half-cocked. We didn't have the right supplies. I mean, we had shortages of Iraqi speakers. You know, we didn't know the ins and outs of Arab etiquette. When we had a lot of unnecessary confrontation with the locals. And if we look at the issue of proportionality, the morally weighted goods achieved by the war outweigh the morally weighted bads. There was no reason to think that would be the case. And it's not just me saying this. In 1993, Dick Cheney was interviewed, and he was asked, why did the senior Bush not invade Iraq and take it out completely? And he's like, well, what would we replace it with? Iran? You know, anarchy? There's no one to replace Saddam with. And he knew that in 1993. And then, well, that's exactly what happened. There was no one to replace Saddam with. Shiite Islam is taking over Iraq. Furthermore, there's the principle of blowback, unforeseen consequences of one's actions, which gave rise to ISIS as of 2011, 5 years after Feser wrote the article. But certainly, the concept of blowback should not be unfamiliar to a philosopher. to someone who's thinking at that, meta level of analysis. And, we wouldn't have had ISIS without getting rid of Saddam. Obviously, from the point of view of Feser, who's a Christian and a Catholic, the amount of Christians who were killed as the result of this dislocation by Islamic fundamentalists was definitely a bad, far outweighed the objectives that we were trying to achieve. So the fact that Feser completely ignores the principle of proportionality, I think, is suspect. It's suspicious.
If I may, he does in his second at the start of his second his second essay, say he doesn't use the word proportionality, but he tries to defend the argument that the good effects of the war outweigh the bad ones. And he makes three separate claims. First, that modern warfare allows for the American army to spare civilians from most of the deaths that would occur in a war. Second, he would say that we must consider the innocent lives that will be spared by the enforcement of sanctions of the sort Saddam violated. He would, so basically we need to free these people from Saddam's tyranny, and that would be good. He also talks about how we need to put the fear of God into all the other regimes like Libya, so that they won't stockpile their own WMDs. And he also mentions offhand that a lot of the civilians have been killed by people like the Bin Ladenists and the Baathists and the like. So it's not really America's fault that there were all these civilian deaths. It's mostly the bad guys' fault.
Well,
what do you think of that reasoning?
I'd like to jump in here, if I may.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say I didn't know how we were structuring this. Yeah, I didn't know if we were doing it as per our usual roundtable format or if it's kind of an open format. But I did want to say that I agree with what's been said thus far about the sort of retconning of the Catholic just war theory in terms of wanting to defend a particular brand of American imperialist politics. Now, I think, to be sure, in the history of Christendom, especially in terms of the history of Catholicism, Christendom has certainly been no stranger to imperialism. And this probably from time to time has been justified on the grounds of natural law theory or of just war theory. But the problem is that what Feser is doing is he is utilizing these theories that might have been used to, say, justify the activities of the conquistadors or of the Holy Roman Empire, and using them to justify the sort of Republican Party at prayer approach to, spreading Judaism and evangelical Christianity, that kind of generic brand of, you might call it Judeo-Christianity, worldwide, as if this is something that, say, Aquinas or Augustine would have approved of. So in a sense, I think that Feser is actually right in basically saying that the paleo-libertarians, the paleo-conservatives are guilty of retconning just war theory to make it sound as though it is specifically or exclusively defensive. So I think the part of his thesis that Aquinas and Augustine and Suarez and Vittorio, these people were not paleo-conservatives either. But he's trying to sort of make the point that, well, because they weren't paleo-conservatives or paleo-libertarians, that therefore they were neo-conservatives who would have favored the exportation of the American democratic system and evangelical Christianity, when in fact Aquinas or Augustine's view of the Iraq War would probably just have been that it was meant to, spread godlessness and Western liberal degeneracy. So in a sense, I almost think that Feser is guilty of doing what he accuses the paleocons of doing, though they are equally guilty of it as well, and that is basically appropriating what was a convenient system for an earlier time and applying it anachronistically to the American empire, which basically has nothing to do with Christianity. And I would say that this is something that's born out of the neo-Thomistic school, which was centered in the late 19th century at the École de Louvain, and in particular through the figure of Jean Maritain, who was a neo-scholastic thinker who basically tried to completely rework Thomistic natural law thinking so that it justified the United Nations, so that it justified everything that the Americans did in World War II, the American Reformation of Germany, and kind of maneuvering the Japanese into attacking Pearl Harbor and this kind of thing. So this is really a school of kind of neoconservative neo-Thomism that really is something that's born in World War II rather than in the Middle Ages.
I will say one aspect of Feser that I will give him points for in this essay, is especially in the third essay, where he points out sort of what you were hinting at, right, Ruminations, that his opponents are not necessarily being honest with their use of the Catholic tradition. So, for example, he mentions the first group is the Rothbardians. He doesn't specifically name Tom Woods, but I have to think Tom Woods is who he had in mind, because he mentions Catholic Rothbardians. Well, who else is he going to be talking about? And, the Just War states the lawful authority is the state. So it's a little hard to be an anarcho-capitalist and believe in just war, at least claim to be consistent with Catholic teaching on just war, if you argue the state is fundamentally illegitimate. That's true. It's also true that isolationism was a policy of the early American Republic, which at the time it was the policy, was essentially a Protestant republic, which is hardly trad from a Catholic point of view. So paleoconservatives who were claiming to be that trad party are basically taking the policy of a early liberal republic at a point in its history and saying that's the trad foreign policy. Well, no, that doesn't quite pan out either. So in that sense, Feser's within his rights to point those contradictions out. But I feel like he points these things out more to engage in a KYA than anything else, or CYA rather.
Yes, I do think that Feser is right about all of these different groups, except, but you forgot the fourth group that he talks about. The first three groups are the Rothbardian anarchist types, and then the second is the third positionist types, and the third group was the isolationists who were following the earlier liberal tradition. So he's right about these people, but the group number 4 that he criticizes, who he characterizes as the cultural pessimists, he would have I think, given Right Ruminations' description of what Thomas Aquinas's position on the Iraq War would have been, Feser would have characterized Aquinas as being a cultural pessimist, because essentially the cultural pessimists say that the Bush administration is spreading liberal degeneracy, spreading this kind of Protestant evangelicalism and American republicanism around the world, and therefore it's not really, we shouldn't be out there nation building when we have to, when our own culture is so decadent. And Feser's response to them, I think, isn't really satisfactory. His response to this is basically to go, well, the Bush administration is often characterized by its opponents as being like a medieval opposed to same-sex marriage, abortion, and stem cell research. And he also and how often he frequently refers to God and Jesus. And the main opponents to the war are secular Europe, who Feser regards as godless. So if secular European leftists who endorse gay marriage and abortion are the main opposition to the war, and the president who's opposed to abortion and euthanasia and same-sex marriage, then obviously this war, the cultural pessimists are wrong to oppose the war on the grounds that it will just spread American liberal democracy. What would you say? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. What would you say to such an argument, Right Ruminations?
Well, I would say that he has mischaracterized, despite the fact that I think we're both in agreement that some of his criticisms of the paleo-conservatives and paleo-libertarians is correct. I think that in some cases he is grossly unfair to them, in that, like, for example, the way that he dismisses the Rothbardians as violating just war theory because their private security agency would be motivated by profit, and going to war for profit is bad. Well, I'm pretty sure that you can't really find any Rothbardians who advocate preemptive war on the basis that it would make them money. So whether you agree with their mechanism or not, that is a gross misrepresentation of what their position is. And secondly, with respect to what he says about the U.S. Constitution and how, well, they had said that the paleocons want a declaration of war from Congress. Well, and his argument is that, well, all governments settle into policy procedures which are not necessarily what's written down on the books. But that is the necessity for Congress to declare war is more than something that's simply written down on paper. It's something that was followed for 150 years in American history, and was specifically part of the deal by which the U.S. Constitution was sold to the people, that they wouldn't be involved in any wars unless they were declared from Congress. And he just kind of brushes that aside as sort of paleo-conservative wishful thinking nonsense. Well, no, it was reality for 150 years. With respect to the cultural pessimism thing, well, I would just say that I'm going to say something that might surprise you. I think in a certain sense, he's actually correct about what people in the past might have said with respect to, whether we should be culturally pessimistic or whether we should be or not be too grandiose in our visions. I think that, to be honest, much of the past in Christendom was very vainglorious, used foreign policy for ecumenical purposes, and was basically non-regionalistic. I think you can see this with the Holy Roman Empire. You can see it with the Byzantine Empire. You can see it with various Protestant imperial manifestations. But so on the one hand, I would say that I don't know if Aquinas or Suarez would necessarily be convinced by the angle of argumentation from humility in foreign policy. But I think what they would say, quite simply, is that the American empire is not a Christian empire. So sure, we may be okay with the imperial endorsement of Christian values, but that this is not a Christian empire, so it's a total non sequitur. I also am at odds with Feser's sort of implication that because these manuals from the 19th century that he cherishes so much seem to not be in contradiction with the policies of George W. Bush, that therefore there is something intrinsically admirable about the war. I would say there may very well be Christian opposition. There may be grounds of Christian opposition to the Iraq War. I doubt that they would come, though, from the scholastic manuals.
Yeah, one aspect about this, and GeoCon, you and I have discussed this in private, relating to this series of essays, is Feser wants to argue that a just war can be viewed independently of a prudent war, but in part tied up in the concept of proportionality, that a just war by definition must be a prudent war. And let me put it this way. If we look at the past 1,000 years of Western interventions into the Middle East, how many have been successful? I.e., either achieving the stated objective of the invader, the Crusades come to mind, or achieving some broader good effects. So for example, England, I guess, even in World War I, maybe you couldn't say was a Christian power anymore, but it carved up the Ottoman Empire, which was an absolute disaster, which saddled us with the problems we have now. And they could, in the sense of a just war criteria of being able to win the fight, they beat the Turks, but the peace was a complete disaster. I mean, literally, World War I is the poster child for a war that is fought for selfish gain rather than a just cause. One could even argue the Second Iraq War is a poster child for a war fought for gain and not for some objectively just cause. And again, prudence would dictate that Western interventions in the Middle East, whether you couch them in terms of a crusade or imperialism or whatever, are not very successful. The Soviets failed in Afghanistan. Why would we succeed? That's not really at all teased out or dealt with seriously. So what do you have to say about that, GeoCon?
Well, I would largely agree with you. And the reason why I would agree with you is how, and this is something that I've talked to one of my family members who supports he supports the neocons largely, but one of his major complaints with them about war is that they always go in half-cocked, no plan, not really thinking things through, and not willing to go all in and like, if you want to be imperialist, then you ought to be as imperialist as possible and make sure you get the job done thoroughly, or else you're just going to have all these different complications occur. Like, I get. I mean, what were the? The U.S.'s goal in fighting Iraq was to punish Saddam Hussein for possibly supplying weapons and support to terrorists like Al Qaeda, and covertly having WMDs, which would have been in violation of the UN treaty they signed back in the 90s. And Dick Cheney said it best. If we take out Iraq, then then we don't have a backup plan. I mean, who are we going to replace Saddam with? I guess Dick Cheney himself answered that in 2003 when he went along with the Iraq War. The answer is nobody. Nobody's going to replace Saddam Hussein. And as Ron Paul predicted, Iran became a regional power. And that's causing the neoconservative right no end of grief.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to go over to Right Rumination since I thought it was his turn, but
go ahead. Go ahead, Right Ruminations.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I maybe didn't hammer home hard enough the point that he just brushes off the issue of a war having to be declared by the just authority, right? He just says that's the way things are done now. Wars are declared by the president or not declared at all, and that's just how we do it. He doesn't address any counter arguments the way he does with other issues by, say, constitutional scholars. he seems to give really no more attention to it than someone like Mark Levin would. He just assumes that the mechanism in place for declaring wars is nothing but a formality. Secondly, building on things that both of you just said, by this standard that he's employing, regardless of whether it's in keeping with Catholic teaching or not, would essentially justify any imaginable war that you wanted to justify. That is, if you can justify these wars without concrete aims, without, I suppose, a reasonable chance of success empirically, that are dubiously under the sanction of the justly appointed authority, then I can't really imagine any war in history that someone like him would want to justify, that they wouldn't be able to justify. So it's all very suspiciously convenient. I also want to make mention of a couple of other things that came out, that stood out to me when I was reading the article, or the three articles. One, sort of a third point, is that he goes after the paleocons for their irate, exclusivist, irascible behavior. Now, to be honest, this justly characterizes probably a majority of paleo-conservative editors or editorialists. But it doubly characterizes the neoconservatives who were supporting the Iraq War at the time, who could barely carry a conversation with anyone for 10 seconds. And this includes Catholics. I've spoken to such people. And speaking, I don't mean to create a straw man, but I've been in these circles enough that to know that to talk to a kind of neo-tradcon Iraq war supporter is basically on the level of civility of talking with Sean Hannity or Bill O'Reilly. So like the idea that in any way that, you know, a Tom Fleming or Pat Buchanan or a Tom Woods or whoever is worse is just kind of absurd. And I think that with the respect to the Ba'athists, he just sort of casually talks about toppling the Ba'athist regime in Iraq. Well, the toppling of the Ba'athist regime basically in favor of this kind of Semitico-centric vision of replacing the Middle East with chaos by toppling kind of, you know, Christian tolerant dictators in the service to Israel, and then somehow attributing that to congruency with the views of Aquinas is just absolutely perception bending. I can only imagine what the medieval scholastics would have thought if any one of them were to come and see the idea of this liberal Protestant nation basically toppling Ba'athist dictators in the interest of Israel being justified on the grounds of Catholic natural law doctrine.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. One element I think that is important to focus on is, I think, partly why Feser has these blind spots and makes these slips that you would think a man of his caliber wouldn't make. Is it's generally been apparent to me in his public interactions with intellectuals he disagrees with. Ed Feser has a very intemperate attitude, whether it's with the anti-capital punishment Catholics, when he wrote, By His Blood, the justification for capital punishment. He's specifically responding to anti-capital punishment Catholics. I guess not, I would include Pope Francis, but, and then also his interaction with the David Bentley Hart, who, yeah, was David Bentley Hart an ass? Probably, but he was mostly playful and mostly just trying to elicit a response. I mean, that's really what David Bentley Hart's MO was. You know, I'm just going to press all the buttons at once and see what Feser does tomorrow. And that's kind of a problem, right? It's even more, it's doubly a problem in the fact that he's complaining that paleocons are a pain in the ass. Well, like, whoa, Ed, you're doing exactly the same thing, probably worse than what you're accusing people like, you know, Rothbardian and Catholics of and paleocons.
Oh, well, we can look at the conclusion where he says, he in one paragraph, he says that it's a very serious thing to accuse the president of manifest injustice, to characterize one's own country as a fool, and smugly to tell one's countrymen that the blood of their sons and daughters has been wasted in the service of that evil. And then in the very next sentence, he says that these people disgrace themselves and dishonor their country, and that they fail to perceive this disgrace and dishonor compounds this offense, and that they're basically adopting the same tactics as Marxists. And then in the next paragraph, he says that to say that such people provide aid and comfort to the enemy is not a cheap exercise in hyperbole, but a statement of cold, hard fact. Well, here's the thing.
Did Saint Francis provide aid and comfort to the enemy?
Well, that's one for the that is one of Todd's one-liners for this evening. But the I guess what I would say is Ed Feser is no stranger to polemics. I mean, he's written out. He has written in defense of his polemical tone, and he claims that, you know, if the other person is being polemical first, then you have the right to be equally polemical. But but then it just kind of turns into a sort of this kind of turns into a sort of like, he did that first, no, he hit me first sort of deal, where you have to go, okay, were the neocons mean to the paleocons first, or were the paleocons mean to the neocons first? Yeah, you know, it's this kind of back and forth. And Feser, you know, I've seen Feser write elsewhere that he doesn't even understand the paleocon-neocon conflict. Like, he thinks that those words are just buzzwords that have no definitions. So, yeah, he doesn't seem to understand what he's wading into. And like I said at the beginning of this, he's going out there and making these polemical attacks because one, two of his favorite thinkers, Michael Novak and David S. Otterberg, were attacked by these same group of people as neocons, and two, he didn't like how they wrote their book. They wrote this book entitled Neocon, and that's very immature. You know? So he feels the need to lower himself to those standards, basically.
Yeah, right ruminations. What are your thoughts?
Well, I was thinking earlier today that if I had to spend the day in the head, in the mindset, truly believing in the views of any other ideology than my own, I'm tied between either a neo-tradcon or a national Bolshevik, and I can't decide which one I'd like to spend the day as. But with respect to him wanting to hit back polemically against the paleo-conservatives, this does not really make a lot of sense to me. Because if you are engaging in sloppy polemics, if you are engaging in intellectual sloppiness, then that is one of two things. It is either bad intellectualism, in which case you confront it in the intellectual realm through preferring a better opinion, or it's a social transgression, in which case you tell the person to shut the hell up. You don't retaliate by responding with equally sloppy intellectual responses. If it's a social problem, then you address it as a social problem. If it's an intellectual problem, you address it as an intellectual problem. You don't split the difference and say, well, I'll be dishonest back. I think might be a decent way of looking at that particular issue. With respect to Feser's conflict or his debates with Bentley Hart, I mean, all of that's very entertaining because in many ways he's kind of the anti-Bentley Hart, isn't he? That is, for Bentley, I think that the difference between Bentley Hart and Feser is that for Feser, being a Catholic is all about being a good middle American, whereas I think for Bentley Hart, being a good Christian is all about being as unlike a good middle American as possible. So there would be a serious theological conflict when you have two people of diverging views, basically framing their Christianity on the extent to which they are or are not a good American. But I think that overall, it's difficult to plead for the social case, let's say, the intellectual but social case of the neo-tradcon, because they're not addressing intellectual polemicism the way an intellectual would, which is either addressing it in the social realm or addressing it responsibly in the intellectual realm. Instead, they're just falling to the same level of intellectual and polemical sloppiness.
Well, exactly. And, I'm going to paraphrase Murray Rothbard here, but in the context of economics, Murray Rothbard makes a very interesting and relevant statement. It is no crime to be ignorant of foreign affairs, which is, after all, a specialized discipline and one that mostly considered to be a dismal science. But it is totally irresponsible to have a loud and vociferous opinion on foreign affairs subjects while remaining in this state of ignorance. And I think this is exactly what Ed Feser did. And he also did it again 5 years later in his January 3rd, 2011 entry on unconditional surrender, where he's like, okay, yellow man bad, yellow man needs to be defeated, unconditional surrender defeats yellow man. I mean, that's literally what his unconditional surrender article was. But this is sort of my broader criticism of the just war, because there's this kind of assumption. Okay, if we were to assume that any nation were to pursue the policies of unconditional surrender towards, say, a traditional Catholic nation, a nation that Ed Feser would support and think is morally righteous, would he be so eager to accept those arguments that they would couch of his favored nation? Well, no, he wouldn't. But that's just completely special pleading, because it's the same kinds of arguments based on the same kinds of evidence. And it's like, well, okay, if somebody were to nuke a Catholic city in the name of, ending papal imperialism, would he be okay with that? Of course he wouldn't. But then, any explanation why that wouldn't be okay would essentially amount to special pleading. What are your thoughts on that, Mr. GeoCon?
I'm familiar with the article he's written, and yeah, Fesser's position seems to completely baffle me, because he wants to hold that the atom bomb was more intrinsically unjust because it targeted civilians, which I would agree with. But on the other hand, he wants unconditional surrender, and his reasoning was, well, the Japanese were well known to fight to the death no matter what, and so unconditional surrender was the only option. Well, the unconditional, I think you've told me about this, Todd. Unconditional surrender is was basically decided as the strategy all the way back in 1943. So, and that this was before most of the wars in the Middle East. Hold on a second. Okay. This was before most of the wars in the Pacific. Sorry, most of the wars in the Pacific had even gotten started. So the Japanese at the time hadn't obtained this sort of reputation of fighting to the death. Perhaps the Japanese were told that the Americans would give them no quarter, so you might as well fight to the death anyway. That sort of thing. And I think this is a reoccurring problem, and it can be easily applied to Feser's argument for the Iraq War, because particularly when he talks about the hidden motives of the American government, because maybe this wouldn't have been known back in 2006, but Feser kind of Feser has a habit of dismissing people who believe in quote unquote conspiracy theories as basically implying using a Marxist view of reality, or a Nietzschean view of reality, hermeneutics of suspicion. And that is a common argument that he uses against these things. And so he says basically that if you're a good trad cat, then you ought to believe what the government tells you until you're, and you have to also ignore all those crazy conspiracy theorists that say that the CIA wants to kidnap your children or something, and so but as several people have pointed out, especially in the recent one recent thinker, Nick Fuentes, a lot of Israel's foreign policy influences America's foreign policy. For instance, the people that wrote the Clean Break memo, Robert Pearl and Douglas Feith, outlined this policy of destroying Iraq and trying to neutralize Syria and Libya in order to help Israel defend its northern border. And these people got jobs in the State Department under George Bush, and they created something called the Office of Special Plans, or OSP, that in the words of the Guardian, and who reported this at the time, basically served as a back channel for the office of the Prime Minister of Israel to pass along intelligence that was so outrageous about Saddam Hussein that not even Mossad would greenlight it. So essentially, it just strikes me as Feser being completely ignorant of what's actually happening on the ground, the actual history of the events. And I'll just say, I'll just paraphrase what E. Michael Jones said about Thomists, that there's nothing about Thomism that will teach you anything about history.
Right Ruminations.
Well, I like how you introduced Nick Fuentes as a recent thinker, but I will say that with respect to his seeming deference, that is Feser's deference for the United States government, if he is truly the scholastic aficionado that he presents himself as being, then where does this reverence for a Protestant, let alone a secular government, come from? If you were to have told the Elizabethan Catholics that they had to give Queen Elizabeth the benefit of the doubt because this is our ruler and she's appointed by God, their position would probably be something like, well, she isn't appointed by God because she's an apostate, or something like this, which was Pius V's position. But just on a common sense level, because I don't necessarily have the same kind of adherence to traditionalist scruples that Feser or the paleocons present themselves as having, I would say, oh, why can't you suspect a president? Why can't you suspect that your government may not be on its best behavior? What Feser is basically asking the reader or the adherent of Christianity to do is to err on one side of the truth. That is to not go dispassionately into a specific issue, but to actually go into a question wanting to find one answer over another, which is absolutely contrary to objective thinking. It's absolutely contrary to the scholastic method. You don't ask, what are my leaders doing, and trying to find the answer that will look most favorable towards them. I also want to say, as we come closer to the conclusion, I would imagine that the problem with Feser's whole enterprise here is his misresponse to the paleoconservatives. Because as I indicated at the beginning, he does have a point that scholastic just war theory is not the same as the Rothbardian non-aggression principle. It's not the same as, say, Washington's exhortation to avoid foreign entanglements. It's something from a different era, different circumstances. What he should have said to the paleocons is, do you truly believe in just war theory? Do you care about these ancient scholastic positions on usury? Do you believe in the burning of heretics? Most of them probably don't. Some of them might. Do you believe in the scholastic prohibition of the deadly duel? Well, people like Tom Fleming, who was one of the people who was most obnoxiously condemning the Iraq War on natural law theory, was a supporter of the duel of the Old West, something which was roundly condemned by the pre-Vatican II Roman Catholic Church. So what he should have said to them is, do you believe in this system? Do you believe in this rigid neo-Thomistic political interpretation of reality? And if not, then why are you holding me to that standard in an instance of special pleading? Instead, what he does is he tries to rework his opposition to their claims of being true to the old scholastic position, and tries to make it look as if the neoconservatives are the actual side that are most in keeping with the spirit of just war and of authentic scholasticism, which is absolutely the worst response that he could have given them, especially considering he had an opportunity to take the paleocons down a peg with a sensible response.
Well, you see, this is kind of the weird thing, right? Because on the one hand, whenever Ed Feser gets into these arguments, whether it's just war or capital punishment, he wants to be the hermeneutic of continuity. Oh yeah, continuity. But when the hermeneutic of continuity doesn't fit his views, he just ignores it. I mean, you look at the syllabus of errors, and there's a lot of things that modern day Catholics believe today, including Ed Feser, that once upon a time were in the syllabus of errors. Well, is Ed Feser going to explain how the hermeneutical continuity covers his treasured deviations from historic Catholic teaching? No, of course he won't do that. So I think it's somewhat dishonest out of the gate, because I don't think Feser would argue for putting heretics to death. Okay. I'm not sure what Feser thinks about freedom of religion. Does he think that, non-Catholics should have the right to practice their faith? I mean, if that's the case, well, that runs afoul of the syllabus of errors. And yeah, again, I'm sure if you looked hard enough, you could find some belief that Feser has that is not in continuity with the historic Catholic teaching, and he's totally okay with that. So it's like, okay, Feser, what's up with that? To you, Right Ruminations.
Well, I was trying to quickly summon an article that I had found with respect to his views on religious toleration, and unfortunately, I wasn't able to dig into it enough to know what his position on it is. But I'm going to make a prediction that once I look into it, we will find that his position is probably, and I hope I don't have to put my foot in my mouth on this, but it will probably be with respect to those Catholics who think it's okay to not support religious liberty, that he probably does not take well to that. I'm going to make that my hypothesis.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it looks like we lost GeoCon. I don't know how to contact him. Oh, he's back.
I'm so sorry. My internet just crashed. It does that sometimes.
Well, yeah, I was going to actually throw the ball to you. Then when you dropped out, I threw it to Right Ruminations.
Okay, so I guess it's kind of an informal roundtable, so I wouldn't mind having the last word, as it were. Here's the thing. I really do like Ed Feser as a political philosopher, and I have I kind of enjoy his polemical takes at times. The new atheists, I agree that the new atheists do deserve it sometimes, because they're a bit outrageous in how they carry out arguments. But at the same time, I think that Feser was letting his partisanship rule his political judgment. And I do think that he was also very much unaware of the actual political situation on the ground, as well as the history of foreign conflict in the Middle East. You know, there was so much of it that was he was basically, it was like he was using, he had the manuals out in front of him, and he was using George Bush talking points and matching the George Bush talking points to the manual, what the manual said, and used. But in point of fact, not everything George Bush and neoconservatives said about Iraq was actually true of Iraq at the time.
Exactly. I think before we wrap it up, the last thing that really needs to be said is Ed Feser, of all people, who is well known for criticizing the new atheists for speaking outside of their specially trained discipline. Richard Dawkins might be a fine biologist, but he's certainly not a fine philosopher. Well, you may be a fine philosopher, Feser, but you're not a good historian or social scientist. And maybe you should have put your own words into practice before you wrote that article. Thanks again, Right Ruminations, and Mr. GeoCon for coming on. It's a pleasure as always. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fire podcast, signing off.